Hey everyone, Lisel Crowley here at the Cool Tool Studio. Today I'm going to show you a great project using my new favorite clay, EZ960 Sterling. This is a wonderful clay for rings because it has great strength. Also, you can create the ring flat and then shape it around a mandrel after firing, which gives you a lot of design possibilities. This is the ring we're going to make in today's project, and it's going to use a fire-in-place cubic zirconia. And these rings are also completely adjustable. And for this we need cubic zirconia, stone setting template, thickness frames, ultra clay pick, tweezers, coil roller either wide or narrow, a ring mandrel, a brush and water, clay hydrator and clay. And again, this is the EZ960 Sterling, which is the only clay you would want to use for this project, and sanding materials and cool slip. Let's get started. Okay, so the first step in creating this ring is to create a bezel for the stone, and I've selected an 8mm fire opal cubic zirconia that can be fired in place. To start, I'm going to determine the depth of the stone. To do that, I put the stone upside down on a tough card, and I take some frames. I'm going to take the 8 card, the 6 card, the 3 card, and the 2 card, and I'm going to run my coil roller over it. And if you can see that the stone is not moving. If I press really hard it will, but if I just do it lightly it's not moving, and that means that this is deep enough to contain the entire depth of the stone. So now I'm going to take a piece of clay, and I'm working with 960, which is my absolute favorite silver clay. I'm going to take a good sized ball of that, and I like to sort of roll it around in a ball first to smooth the outer part of it, and then just press. And that gives me a patty of clay that is deep enough to contain the stone. I'm going to work with these clay punches that Cool Tool sells in the largest one. It's the round 2, the largest one. And this is some cool slip in a little dish. I'm just going to dip it in that for easy release of the clay. And I'm just going to punch out a hole right in the middle of that. And I'm going to reclaim my clay. Always put your clay away before you proceed. Now I'm going to take my stone, place it point side down in that hole, get it centered, put my guides back, and press. And what this does is the rolling frames keep you from pressing too far, and the coil roller gets that stone set in there perfectly level and right under the surface, which is perfect placement for the stone because you want the clay as it shrinks to grab onto the stone, not to push it out. The next step is to take my bezel template that's calibrated to the different sizes, get it centered on there by eye, take my ultra clay pick, which is one of my favorite metal clay tools ever, and just for added release, I'm going to dip that also in the cool slip. Now when I cut this out, I'm going to hold the needle tool straight up and down and go all the way around. I'm going to cut away the excess clay. And as you're pulling this clay away, it helps to put your finger over the stone so it doesn't move. Final step is to take my frames, take my coil roller and press one more time, and that just seats that stone in there perfectly. So this then can be set aside to dry, and then after it's dried, I'll sand it to make it perfectly smooth, and then I'll be ready to make the ring. Okay, so now to make the ring, the first thing I have to do is determine how long I need to make it so it will wrap around the finger after it's fired. And to do that, I'm going to use a mandrel and a strip of paper. Whenever you make a ring with metal clay, you have to allow for shrinkage. And I typically go 2 to 2.5 sizes higher. So if I want to do a 7 or a 7.5, I'll go up to a 10. So I'm just going to wrap my paper around it. And that's all I need the mandrel for. I'm going to cut this off and tape it to the bottom of one of these narrow coil rollers. Now, Cool Tools makes the coil rollers in a wide and a narrow version. For rolling coils, I prefer the wider version, but for the work surface for a ring, the narrow version is great. And if you have shorter fingers, the narrow version is also great for actually rolling the coils. I'm going to tape my little piece of paper down. And this just gives me a guide as to the minimum length I need my coil to be to wrap around the finger after firing. The next step is to make a coil. And I'm going to take a little lump of 960 clay, and you don't need a lot of clay because you're making a rather narrow coil. And I'm just going to start rolling that coil, and I want to make sure I make the ends tapered, and I want to make sure it's a nice long coil. The wider the diameter of your coil, the thicker the band of your ring is going to be. So if you want a very delicate ring, you want to make a very delicate coil. You also want to work fairly quickly so that your clay doesn't dry out too much. Now that I've got my coil rolled, I'll just gently lay it on my work surface here. And I'm going to use a brush to moisten it. And the reason for that is anytime you bend this clay, you run the risk of surface cracks if you haven't really moistened the surface of the clay. Now I'm going to shape it. And I like to just give it a random undulating shape. And then I'd like also one side to be high and one side to be low, because as it wraps around the finger, as on this ring here, you want it to wrap around on top of each other. So I'm just going to make a little swirl on that end, and maybe just a little taper on that end. Okay, now I'm going to actually flatten this, and the way I'm going to do that is to take my 4-card thick rolling frame and set it on top of the coil roller. And I want to take another coil roller and lubricate it with the Cool Slip. And the reason for that is that I've dampened that clay. If I don't lubricate this and I press it onto the clay, it's going to stick. So I'm going to lubricate it and then take off the excess. And now I'm just going to very lightly press. And that's going to just flatten that coil to make your ring shank. And now you can see where there was a little bit of sticking, but I can just lightly brush over that with water and clean that up. So now I'm going to create an embellishment. And I'm going to take a very small pinch of clay. Again, I'm going to start the coil with my finger. And I'm going to use the non-lubricated side of my coil roller. If I try to use the lubricated side of my coil roller, it will just slide around. And I want a very slender coil. Once I get it on my work surface, I'm going to wet it. And if it's a little clunky where it attaches to the clay, I can just bring my clay pick, which is one of my favorite metal clay tools ever, and taper it. And after I taper it, I'll just take my brush and smooth that down. Okay, there's one embellishment done. And I like to do 2 or 3 embellishments. It just, you could get as elaborate as you want, really, with these rings. My designs tend to, at this point in time, be very similar to each other. As I work more with this technique, I will be making more elaborate designs, but I wanted to start you all out on this video with a fairly basic and easy one. And this clay is wonderful for rolling coils. It's very forgiving. It stays flexible long. It's absolutely my favorite metal clay at this point in time. Again, once it's rolled, I'm going to wet it and then create my little attach it in different places. And as long as you keep it moist, you can really play with the design. Notice how I just keep trying different things until I find something that works for me. I think I'll go with that. And if I wanted to trim this off, not only just to taper the end, but maybe to make it shorter, I could just come into here and trim. As long as you keep the clay moist, you have leeway to play with the design and the placement. Now I'm going to place my stone. Actually, I need to place a little bit more clay. I've decided to put my stone here, but I need to place a little bit more clay around here, so I'm going to do one more embellishment. So now I just need to add some more embellishments to create a better foundation for my stone. So I'm going to pinch off another small piece of clay. Roll a nice tapered coil. And I've given myself probably way more than I need, but I always like to have a lot to play with. So I think what I'll do is have it come out from here. Trim it off, maybe right about here. And you see how I can really play with that shape as long as I keep it moist. I just want to taper this where it connects to the ring a little bit more. And now I have a seat for my stone right here where the spiral is. So I'm just going to take my bezel stone, wet it really well. And again, this clay bonds beautifully just with water. And I'm going to place that on there and wiggle it and press it down. The final step for this would be to embellish with what I call granulation. Granulation is a technique that's used in metalsmithing quite frequently, and it's adding little embellishments of tiny balls of in this case clay. In metalsmithing it would be metal. So I'm going to roll some small little balls of clay, and I'll roll several in different sizes. And if you prefer, you can have a bunch of different metal clay balls rolled and dried. I like to work with moist clay when I make them. Doesn't take much to make them. Get a few rolled and start placing them, and then I'll see if I need to roll more. And I like to position them with my brush. Sometimes I use a lot, sometimes I use a little, sometimes I don't use any. but I always like to at least audition them and see how I like them. I always work in odd numbers, either 1, 3, 5, etc. And this is, to me, the playful kind of relaxed kind of designing as you go that I like to do. I like to let a piece sort of unfold as I'm working on it. You always want to think about your placement not only visually but structurally as something that makes sense for the piece. So I'm going to say that that's the design I want. I'm going to reclaim all this clay. And I have some Cool Slip in a little dish here. I'm going to moisten my fingers and really press down on those balls to make sure that they're connecting really well to the clay. Now, one of the things I love about this clay is that it doesn't require a lot of paste to get things to bond. So at this stage, I'm just going to dry the piece, and then I'll reinforce with moisture around all the connections, and then I'll dry it one more time, and then I'll sand it, and then it will be fired. And the ring itself will be bent over a mandrel after it's fired. So here's the piece that has been dried. I dried it in the dehydrator for about a half hour, 45 minutes. You can also air dry it. You'd probably want to give it a couple hours if you were air drying. The first thing I'm going to do on this piece now is flip it over. And you can see this skin. And that's from the water creating a little excess skin of clay. And the very first thing I'm going to do is take a damp brush, not soaking wet, but damp, and brush that skin down. And as I brush that skin down, what's happening is not only is it smoothing the piece out, but it's creating a little bit of extra clay where the pieces join to help give a stronger bond. And also notice I'm supporting the whole piece in my hand. I don't want to put any pressure on it that could cause it to bend or break, because it's fairly flimsy at this stage. So again, I'm just brushing all these edges and making taking special care where everything's are joined together, like the little balls and where these extra pieces join. Same thing here, where my bezel set stone is attached to the clay. Now I'm going to set this down. I'm actually going to move this slightly so it's hanging off the edge, so it's not bent. And I'm just going to do a little bit more right here. And this will go back in the dehydrator for about 5 more minutes. So here's the piece that I brushed on the back, and now I'm going to very lightly sand over the top. And for this, I like to use a sanding pad rather than a sanding stick, just because it's a little more flexible and a little more forgiving. And I want to use a very light touch and just go in one direction, because remember, this is still a very fragile piece because we're working so delicately. Once it's fired, it'll be plenty strong, but at this stage, we want to be very careful. So I'm very lightly sanding over the surface, and I'm going in one direction. And I basically just want to make sure it's smooth. And then I'll take my dry sanding brush and brush away the dust. And then I'm going to pick it up. Now this is going to be just a little top heavy because of that stone, so I got to make sure that is supported. And I'm just going to very lightly sand along the side edge. And especially wherever there's a tapered join, I want to sand and feel it with my finger to make sure there's no sharpness there. If I were to miss that, post-firing you can still sand. It's just a little easier at this stage of the game. This is a very delicate piece, so I'm going to do a very light sanding on this. And finally, before firing, I would clean the stone off with alcohol. So this is the piece that's been fired. And the first thing I'm going to do is just brush it with a steel brush. You can also use a brass brush, but if you use brass, you would want to use soap and water. And I'm just doing an initial brushing, and then we'll be putting it in the tumbler. But before we tumble it, I want to bend it around the mandrel. And this is what I love about this EZ960 sterling, that you can make the ring flat and then shape it after firing. So I've got my ring mandrel, and I'm going to work on a size 7. And I really can just very gently and carefully bend it with my fingers. And I'm going to go slow. I don't want to go too fast. But the clay, I'm sorry, the silver, the sterling silver is really strong. I'm not getting any surface cracks. And it's bending beautifully. Okay, I don't even really have to hammer it. But if you had to do some real fine shaping, you could come in with a rawhide mallet and shape it. And there I've got a beautiful round ring. You can see how it looks on the finger. And this is adjustable so that you can try it on different fingers, or you can make it smaller or larger should you need to. Like this one might fit on this finger. I won't try that. You can also pull it apart a little if you want. And I think the design possibilities for this type of ring are endless. So the EZ960 clay, the only clay I would use for this. So here's our finished ring. It's been formed around the mandrel. I did not choose to patina this ring, although you could patina it. Sometimes I like to leave them bright, and sometimes I like to patina them. You could wear this on any finger. It actually makes a great thumb ring. But you can adjust it to fit any finger, and you can wear it for many years. The strength of this clay is amazing after firing.
Visit our Learning Center at cooltools.us for more cool jewelry making videos. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and be sure to sign up for our email list to be the first to hear about new videos, new products, and other cool stuff from Cool Tools.